A trainee endures humiliation, being poured coffee on her, being laughed at behind her back, until she reveals who her sister is. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you're from. Emily Bailey's mornings began with silence, not the passive kind that settled naturally into bedrooms just before dawn, but a practiced, purposeful silence, a cultivated stillness that enveloped her penthouse apartment 31 floors above the Manhattan skyline. Her bare feet met the temperature-controlled hardwood as she stepped out of bed at precisely 5:30. The digital clock on her nightstand did not blink or tick. She had disabled both functions. Distraction was inefficient. Sound was unnecessary. Emotion had no place here. She moved through the apartment as though rehearsing a choreography she had long ago perfected. The white marble counter, the black Nespresso machine, the folded charcoal-gray towel laid over the edge of the chrome sink, all where they belonged. The robe she pulled around herself hugged her frame like a ceremonial shroud, the fabric never wrinkling under pressure. She poured a cup of coffee without cream or sugar, swallowed half, and left the rest on the counter to cool. In the bathroom, the lights adjusted automatically to 78% intensity, calibrated for optimal focus and reduced eye strain. She washed her face in cold water and studied her reflection without expression. Her skin was smooth, pale but healthy, her eyes unwavering even in solitude. This was a face that offered no invitation, a face that had closed its gates years ago. Her closet, larger than most Manhattan apartments, opened at her approach. The motion sensors detected her presence, casting a soft light on a row of identically pressed suits. Black, navy, charcoal, minimal contrast. She selected the navy today. It matched the agenda's tone. Structured, decisive, unforgiving. By 6:10 a.m., she was seated in the back of a black company car with tinted windows. The driver, Marcus, greeted her without waiting for a response. He knew the rules. She never answered small talk, never allowed it. Instead, she opened her tablet and began skimming the day's reports. Declining productivity in UX. 3 employees over budget. 1 request for paternity leave. She flagged that last one not to deny it, but to ensure continuity in the team's delivery schedule. Accommodation did not exempt accountability. The city streamed past the windows in ghosted blurs of movement. She did not look out. She never looked out. What was there to see that could be quantified? Bailey Systems occupied 6 floors of a high-rise near Bryant Park. The building itself was steel and glass like her company's culture, transparent in theory, cold in practice. She arrived at 6:45 a.m., though the workday officially began at 9. By the time her team filtered in, she would have already read, analyzed, and annotated every proposal on her desk. As she entered the lobby, security stood a little straighter. A woman at the front desk offered a brittle smile, not expecting one in return. Emily walked through biometric doors that opened silently and stepped into the elevator. Floor 46. Her private level. No music, no promotional posters, no ambient cheer. The elevator ascended in absolute quiet. Her office, larger than the average New York condo, was a study in geometric control. Frosted glass partitions separated areas for work, briefings, and solitude. An obsidian desk, free of clutter, sat before a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a panoramic view of the city. She rarely glanced at it. Her assistant, Meredith, entered at precisely 7 with the morning brief. Meredith was efficient, polite, invisible in all the ways that made her indispensable. Emily read through the files without comment, signed the necessary approvals, and returned them without a word. Meredith left, another appointment filled its place. The morning passed in sequences of analysis and judgment. One executive stumbled during a metrics presentation. Emily waited until he had finished before correcting his conclusions with numbers she had memorized the night before. He thanked her as though she'd saved him from drowning. No one joked in Emily Bailey's presence. No one laughed unless she initiated it, which she never did. Her meetings were conducted with clinical clarity. Expectations were stated once. Failures were not revisited. They were replaced. By 2 p.m, she had already denied 2 product expansions and initiated a restructure in the operations team. At 4, she hosted a cross-continental video conference with the European division and instructed them to condense a 6-month rollout into 3. They agreed. Of course they did. Her reputation stretched across the Atlantic like a wire drawn taut. At 6:15, she ended her day with a final pass through the finance projections. She made 3 notes, highlighted 2 variables, and closed the file. The office was empty by then, her floors a hushed cathedral of glowing screens and abandoned coffee mugs. She stood, stretched once with mechanical precision, and gathered her things. Her heels clicked against the stone floor as she moved toward the elevator alone. The car ride home was just as quiet as the one that morning. Marcus did not ask about her day. She appreciated that. She read through one last email from the board, gave a 1-line reply, and shut the tablet with a snap. Her apartment was just as she had left it, untouched, immaculate, sterile. She removed her shoes, placed them in their exact spot, and crossed the living room. The city's lights blinked outside her floor-to-ceiling windows. She didn't look at them. Instead, she paused before the only personal item on display in her entire home. It was a photograph, framed in simple wood, aged at the corners but clean. In it, 2 girls sat on a tire swing beneath a maple tree. The older one, sharp-jawed, already serious, had her arms loosely around the younger, a freckled thing with wild hair and a crooked smile. Their knees were muddy. The sunlight caught in their hair like gold. Emily stared at the photo for a long time. Her hand, poised to adjust the frame, hovered but didn't touch. Then she turned away. She sat down with the second half of her morning coffee, now cold, and opened her laptop. The agenda for next week's intern onboarding session blinked on her screen. She did not smile, but her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The file she opened next was labeled Haley Bailey. The cursor hovered over it. Then she clicked. The first morning, Haley Bailey entered the offices of Bailey Systems as a registered intern. The lobby's polished floors reflected her sneakers with a clarity that unsettled her. The building loomed around her, glass and metal stretching high like a monument to cold ambition. She clutched the strap of her canvas backpack tightly across her chest, fingers nervously gripping the frayed edge of the fabric as she stepped inside. The receptionist glanced up without much interest, offering a bland smile before returning to her screen. Haley introduced herself quietly, and the woman gestured toward a row of elevators with the practiced disinterest of someone who had already greeted too many newcomers that week. Haley had arrived 15 minutes early, though she had paced around the block for another 10 before gathering the courage to come in. Her instructions were clear: report to the 22nd floor and meet with Department Coordinator Julia Kim. No mention of her surname's significance had been made in the forms or emails. That was by design. Haley had insisted on being treated like anyone else, and Emily, true to form, had obliged with a complete absence of favoritism or warmth. The elevator ride was silent, apart from the hum of motion and the soft flicker of floor numbers overhead. She stared straight ahead, the knot in her stomach tightening with every passing second. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a hallway that smelled faintly of ozone and printer paper. The space was hushed, the carpeting thick and expensive, muting even the light shuffle of her steps. At the far end of the corridor, an open-plan workspace came into view, rows of minimalist desks, ergonomic chairs, and employees already absorbed in their screens. She was greeted by a brisk woman in her 30s with sharp features and tightly pulled hair. Julia Kim extended a hand, not unkindly, but without enthusiasm. Haley shook it, trying to conceal the tremble in her fingers. Julia's introduction was efficient. This was the Marketing Innovation Division. She would shadow 3 team members across a 6-week rotation. Tasks would include research synthesis, presentation formatting, data visualization, and occasional logistics. There was no mention of coffee runs, but Haley wouldn't have minded. She had braced herself for less. Her desk was a small workstation near the corner, separated from the others by a half partition. It was clean, featureless, and already contained a welcome packet with her name printed in bold, neutral font, Haley Bailey. No one looked up when she took her seat. A few curious glances passed over her like passing headlights, momentary, distant, but no one approached. By noon, she had been handed her first assignment, compiling market data from a drive folder and translating it into a readable brief. She set to work with the anxious diligence of someone who believed every comma was a referendum on her worth. She double-checked every chart, rephrased clumsy summaries, added source links even though they hadn't been requested. When she emailed it to her designated reviewer, she received a one-word response half an hour later. Received. The days that followed began to blur into each other with sterile rhythm. She arrived early, left late, and worked through lunch. Her effort was quiet but consistent. When she noticed empty cups left near the copy machine, she began throwing them out. She volunteered to clean up after meetings, even though no one asked her to. A few people began to nod at her in the hallways, but the gestures were cautious, impersonal. Conversations flowed around her like she was an empty chair. It took just under a week for the nature of her environment to shift from chilly to quietly hostile. The first incident was subtle. Haley arrived to her desk to find her monitor locked, a post-it stuck on the edge that read, "Hope you back this up." Her files were untouched, but the implication stung. No one took responsibility. She laughed nervously to herself and dismissed it as a joke, an attempt at hazing maybe. The second came a day later. She'd spent hours working on a spreadsheet cross-referencing ad analytics with demographic overlays. When she presented it to her team contact, a man named Carl, he glanced at it for 2 seconds before saying, "We already did this last quarter. Didn't anyone tell you?" The data had changed, but the message was clear. She had wasted her time. Later that afternoon, she heard laughter as she walked past the kitchenette. Her name wasn't mentioned directly, but the phrase, "Some intern thinks she's going to solve marketing strategy in week 1, hung in the air like smoke. When she turned the corner, the group inside fell silent. One of them looked at her with open amusement and said nothing. She offered a thin smile and left. Haley began writing everything down in a private file on her laptop. Not for revenge, not for evidence, but for clarity. A personal log, she told herself. Documentation helped her feel less adrift. She recorded the dates, the tasks, her reactions. She never mentioned Emily, not once. That was a rule she had made before her first day. She was here to earn her place, not borrow it. Emily, true to her word, maintained complete silence. They did not cross paths. not in meetings, not in elevators, not even in briefings. The upper executive floor might as well have existed on another planet. Haley caught glimpses of her sister's name on internal memos or corporate briefings passed around, but it was always distant, impersonal. She didn't even know if Emily knew where she was seated. By the end of the second week, the passive dismissals had turned into something more organized. Assignments came late and with no context, then were picked apart for failing to meet unspoken expectations. One afternoon, she arrived at her desk to find a printout of an email she'd sent, with her grammatical errors highlighted in red ink. "Proofread much?" someone had scribbled in the margins. That night, she stayed in the building until after 9, re-editing everything she had submitted that week. No one noticed. No one said thank you. She began to feel the shift in herself, too. The mornings grew heavier. Her posture tightened. Her eyes, once bright with a tentative optimism, now watched the office like a battleground, scanning for signs of danger. She no longer offered help at the copy machine. She stopped staying for team lunches she wasn't invited to. But she still arrived early, still did the work. In the evenings, she rode the subway back to her tiny studio in Brooklyn, collapsing into bed without energy for anything but sleep. She didn't call Emily. She didn't even message her. Pride held her back, but more than that, shame. What would Emily think if she knew her younger sister couldn't even handle a corporate internship? Yet, what Haley didn't know was that Emily had already seen the red-inked email. It had passed through a forwarded internal thread Meredith flagged, and while Emily hadn't responded, she had read it twice. Still, she said nothing. At the end of her third week, the entire team gathered for a status meeting. Haley sat near the back, typing notes. When she offered a small correction about a mislabeled data set, something she had noticed that contradicted the lead analyst's chart, he waved her off with a tight smile and a clipped, "Thanks, but we've got it." Minutes later, her manager made the same point and was congratulated for spotting the inconsistency. Haley felt the floor beneath her shift, not physically, but emotionally. A quiet erasure had taken root. They weren't just ignoring her, they were stripping her of value. After the meeting, she went to the restroom and stood in front of the mirror, her palms gripping the edge of the sink. Her eyes searched her own reflection, not for answers, but for evidence that she still existed, still mattered. She saw a girl in a button-up blouse and slacks, professional, polite, invisible. She saw fear behind the eyes, but also something else, something that refused to fold. When she returned to her desk, someone had written "Smile More" on her keyboard in pink highlighter. She didn't smile. She opened a new document. She began taking notes again, this time with sharper clarity. Not a log, a ledger. She was going to remember. All of it. And she would not leave until she had made them remember her too. The Monday that followed began like the others, silent, gray, and heavy. Haley sat by the window of the subway car, watching raindrops race each other across the glass as the city blurred past. She wore the same slate-gray blazer she had chosen the week before, one that made her look older, sharper, less like someone who could be overlooked. She had slept less than 4 hours, kept awake by the echo of last week's meeting and the mocking scrawl left on her keyboard. She had wiped it off without a word, but it remained in her mind, etched like graffiti on concrete. She had stopped trying to make conversation. The first few weeks had taught her enough. Now she listened more than she spoke, observed more than she reacted. She walked into the building with her chin level, her shoulders back, projecting a confidence that felt like an ill-fitting jacket. No one greeted her as she entered the 22nd floor. Her desk was where she had left it, of course, but something was different. Her chair had been replaced with one 2 inches shorter, forcing her to crane her neck upward to see the monitor. A small change, almost petty, yet perfectly calibrated to irritate. She adjusted the seat silently and began her day. The tasks assigned to her grew more intricate, but also more insidious. The deadlines were tighter, the expectations more obscure. She would receive files missing key data, then be criticized for not identifying the gaps. Carl, who now spoke to her only when strictly necessary, sent a terse message. "We'll need those trend summaries before lunch. Keep them lean." No links, no examples, no guidance. She completed the summaries anyway, cross-referencing 4 internal dashboards and public reports, refining them into a clean 2-page deck. She submitted it at 11:54 a.m. It was returned an hour later with a single comment. Too dry. No elaboration, no suggestions. No praise for speed, nor mention that the metrics she pulled were correct. The following day, someone rearranged the folders on the shared drive. A set of files she'd worked on disappeared, later discovered in a subfolder labeled archive_fail. When she asked Julia about it, the woman raised an eyebrow and said only, "That's strange," before turning away. By week's end, the tone of her existence in the office had shifted fully from cold professionalism to something more targeted. During a lunch break she didn't attend, a team member posted a meme in the casual Slack channel. A joke about interns needing training wheels and tissues. No names were used, but the intent was clear. When Haley saw it later, she didn't react. She took a screenshot and closed the window. Then came the moment that made everything snap into focus. She had been asked to contribute to a campaign brainstorm, a rare opportunity to participate in something visible. She arrived early, notes in hand, only to find that the meeting had been moved, without informing her. The new room was 2 floors up. By the time she arrived, slightly breathless, the group was already mid-conversation. She apologized softly and took the only seat left by the door. As she began to speak, presenting an idea based on niche market segmentation from a podcast study she'd read, she noticed the side eyes exchanged between 2 other interns. Carl leaned forward and said, "That's cute, but let's try to think on a bigger scale. Real solutions, not college assignments." Laughter fluttered through the room. Not uproarious, but enough. She felt it in her spine. Later, she would sit alone in the stall of the restroom, the edges of her vision blurry, her palms pressed against her knees. But she did not cry. Not then. Not yet. The final insult came at the end of that day when she returned to her desk to find her wallpaper changed. The Bailey Systems logo had been replaced by a cartoon pig in a suit holding a sign that said "Boss's Pet." Her breath caught. She stared at it for a full minute before restoring the default background. She checked the log history. No entries. Whoever had done it knew how to cover their tracks. She went home that night in silence, not even registering the shifting city outside the train window. Her mind reeled with the question she had refused to ask. Was it worth it? Was it really strength to endure this, or just foolishness? In her apartment, she sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop open, screen blank. The diary she had been keeping for weeks blinked with its empty cursor. She began typing, slowly at first, then faster. Day 19. Targeted again. I've stopped calling it hazing. It's not random. It's not testing. It's designed to erase me." She paused, hands hovering over the keyboard, then typed again. "They think I'm here because of her, but she hasn't said a word. She watches, if she watches at all, from whatever tower she sits in, and I wonder if she even sees me." She didn't send the file. She didn't need to. The words were for herself. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Emily Bailey had seen more than she admitted. The forwarded emails, the shift in tone from Haley's earliest assignments, the reports filtered through HR about interpersonal friction in the innovation division, all had passed across her screen. Emily had cataloged them without comment, her face unreadable as she scrolled, making annotations only she would understand. Her silence, deliberate and absolute, concealed a churning sea beneath the surface. But it was not time yet. At the office the next morning, Haley walked in with her back straight, hair tied tighter, her blouse buttoned to the collar. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then only with necessity. Her face was calm, but there was a coldness now, a perimeter. Carl approached her desk around mid-afternoon. "Need you to fix up the Q3 deck by 4. Some of the visuals are off." He dropped a USB drive on her desk and walked away. She opened the files. The graphs were mislabeled, the numbers off. Some slides were from last year. She realized this was another trap. She was being handed broken tools and expected to fix them without instruction. She worked until 3:58, sent the revised version, and then waited. No response. The meeting happened without her. She wasn't invited. Again. But this time she didn't sit still. She rose from her chair, not in a rush but with purpose, and walked to the window at the end of the hall. The skyline stared back at her, uncaring, massive. Below it, dozens of offices buzzed with quiet cruelty, the kind that wore a suit and smiled during reviews. She pressed her hand against the glass and made a silent vow, not for revenge, not even for recognition, but for something more elemental. She would not leave until the people who saw her as disposable realized they had underestimated the wrong person. In the elevator ride down to the ground floor, her reflection stood next to her, silent and steady. She didn't flinch when the doors opened. She had walked through fire. Now she would learn how to burn brighter. Haley awoke that morning with the unshakable weight of fatigue pressed against her bones. The dream she had left behind, if it had been a dream at all, faded like steam against glass, too vague to name but vivid enough to leave her heart pounding. For a long time, she sat on the edge of her bed in the pale light of early dawn, her shoulders hunched forward, elbows on knees, the floor beneath her bare feet as cold as the thoughts in her mind. She had come into the company hoping to grow, to learn, to exist outside the shadow of a sister whose name commanded rooms. Instead, she had been reduced, first subtly, then overtly, until she could no longer tell whether she had entered the building each morning as a person or a target. But she had stayed. She had endured, hoping it might shift, believing that dignity would prevail if she proved herself enough times. And yet the weeks had passed without justice, without even acknowledgement. Even now, after the string of incidents and the casual cruelties, no one had stepped in. No one had spoken up. Her worth was a whisper in a storm, drowned out by the louder voices of cynicism and indifference. Still, some quiet force inside her would not let her quit. That same force had carried her through high school with only hand-me-down textbooks and late-night jobs, through college on a scholarship written in effort and debt. That same force now rose again, trembling but alive. She reached her desk at the usual time. The office lights were still dimmed in early mode, the overhead fluorescents clicking into gradual illumination. She turned on her monitor and tried to focus, her eyes dry, her fingers slow on the keyboard. Around her, the world moved on autopilot. Coffee brewing in the lounge, printers warming up, keys clicking like distant rainfall. It was all so ordinary. And yet, for her, everything felt suspended in a delicate stillness, as though the room were waiting for a collapse. At midday, Carl dropped another file onto her desk without a word. She opened it and scanned the spreadsheet. The numbers were misaligned, inconsistent, deliberately tampered with. She knew now not to ask questions. It didn't matter. No one would explain the missing data or incorrect baselines. She was expected to fix it, or fail. She closed the file. Her hands lay still on the keyboard. For a moment, her gaze drifted toward the tall glass wall at the end of the floor. Beyond it, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm, indifferent to the weight she carried. She wondered if Emily had ever stood there and looked down with the same pressure pressing against her ribs, that quiet knowledge of being alone among many. Haley had not spoken to her sister since she joined. It had been a silent pact. No favors, no names. She didn't want handouts. And Emily, as far as she knew, had respected that silence with the same ruthless discipline she applied to every other corner of her life. But, as the office moved around her, unaware or uninterested in the growing fissure beneath its feet, Haley began to wonder if the silence had turned from protection into complicity. That evening, she stayed long past everyone else. The glow of the city beyond the window washed her desk in soft gold. The office, emptied of voices, finally offered a kind of peace. She gathered her belongings slowly. As she reached for her bag, her eye caught something beneath the corner of her keyboard. Another note, this one torn from a notebook and folded twice. She opened it with careful fingers. Still here? How sad. No signature, no handwriting she could immediately identify, but she felt the message settle into her chest like ice. She sat down again. Her hands were trembling now, not with fear, but with the exhaustion of restraint. She had taken the high road so many times it had worn thin beneath her. She had walked through these halls each day as if her silence would be rewarded, as if dignity were enough. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe nothing changed unless someone decided to stop letting it stay the same. In a different part of the building, high above, Emily Bailey sat alone in her office, reviewing budget reallocations and infrastructure proposals. She was aware of the tension on the innovation floor. HR had flagged interpersonal misalignment in their reports, couched in neutral phrasing that hinted at trouble, but never called it by name. Emily had read every line. She had even skimmed some of the email threads, forwarded quietly by Meredith, her assistant, who had started noticing a pattern in the way one intern's name came up again and again, never directly, but always in the margins of blame. Still, Emily had said nothing. She believed in resilience. She had forged her career in the fire of opposition, never asking for rescue, never expecting fairness. She had assumed Haley could do the same. She had convinced herself that this was a gift, a brutal one, but a necessary one. Let her struggle. Let her fight. Let her learn that success never came dressed in kindness. But that night, she opened a folder she hadn't touched in years. It contained only a few files, scanned photos, old school reports, digital copies of drawings once pinned to a shared bedroom wall. One of them was a note, in Haley's childish handwriting, declaring, "One day I'll be like you." Emily closed the folder. The office was quiet around her. She turned off the screen and sat in the darkness, thinking. The next morning, Haley arrived to work earlier than usual. She wanted a moment alone with the quiet before the others came and the air thickened with tension and unseen eyes. She sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. Her email pinged once. It was from a junior team member. The message was short. "You might want to check the shared drive before the meeting." Her stomach tightened. She opened the folder marked Team Presentations. Inside was a new subfolder labeled Friday Laughs. Clicking on it opened a single file. A PowerPoint slide, blank except for a pasted image of her university graduation photo and a caption in blocky text. From magna cum laude to desk joke. Watch out, she bites. Her face flushed with heat, then cold. She closed the laptop slowly and sat back. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from shock, but from something more final. This was no longer casual cruelty. This was orchestrated, designed. She stood and walked toward the kitchenette. The floor had begun to fill, and eyes followed her without subtlety. She poured herself water, hand steady. When she turned, Carl was standing by the copier, laughing softly with another analyst. Neither acknowledged her. She walked back to her desk, picked up her phone, and typed a single message. "I need to speak with you." She hesitated a second, then sent it. 5 minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Conference room 9, now." Emily sat alone at the long table when Haley entered. The lights were off, except for the city light filtering through the windows. For a moment, the two women just looked at each other. Then, Haley stepped forward, placed her phone on the table, and opened her laptop. She turned it toward her sister and spoke, her voice calm but stripped of hesitation. "I've taken it all. I tried to do it the right way, but this is what they think of me now." Emily looked at the screen. Then she looked at her sister. Her jaw tightened. Who else has seen this? No one who would care. Emily nodded once. Then she reached for her phone and dialed. "This is Emily Bailey. I need the floor managers in my office. Now, no delays." She hung up, then stood. Her presence filled the room in a way it hadn't in years, not with intimidation, but with absolute purpose. "You shouldn't have had to bring this to me," she said quietly. "I didn't want to, but I won't let them decide who I am." Emily looked at her, and for the first time in a long time her face softened. "You never let anyone decide who you are." They walked out of the room together. The air in the hallway shifted. People looked up. The silence that followed was not the old one of fear, but something new, something waiting. And it was not going to last long. The hallway outside Conference Room 9 had never felt as still as it did in the moments after Emily and Haley stepped into it side by side. The silence that fell over the floor was not just one of surprise, but of uncertainty, like the air had thickened around everyone's throats. For months, Haley had walked those same corridors alone, unnoticed, deliberately ignored. Now, in a matter of seconds, every eye turned toward her, and those gazes, once indifferent, burned with something else. Confusion, suspicion, fear. Haley didn't flinch. Her posture held steady, her chin level, her hands relaxed at her sides. If anything, she looked taller in that moment than she ever had. No longer the nervous intern, no longer the girl balancing apology in her step. She walked with Emily through the maze of glass and shadow toward the elevator, not speaking, not needing to. The mere alignment of their paths now spoke volumes, and the silence between them no longer felt like distance but purpose. Emily's office, located in the northern wing of the top executive floor, was pristine as always. A low hum from the smart climate control system filled the space like a whisper. Her assistant, Meredith, was already waiting outside the door with a clipboard in hand and a pale look on her face. "They're on their way," she said quietly. "All of them." Emily gave a sharp nod and gestured for Haley to follow her inside. As they entered, the tall windows poured natural light across the obsidian desk and minimalist furnishings. Emily stood behind her chair but didn't sit. Instead, she reached for the tablet resting on her desk, flicked through several documents, and opened an internal messaging thread flagged for legal oversight. Her fingers moved with mechanical precision, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, even if she hadn't. Haley stood near the bookshelves, her arms crossed, watching. She didn't interrupt. She knew this was Emily in her element, orchestrating a response the way she might command a crisis team after a data breach or financial collapse. And yet, the tremor in her fingertips had not entirely disappeared. She reminded herself to breathe, to stay rooted. Within minutes, a knock came at the door. Meredith opened it without invitation, ushering in 5 individuals, 4 department heads, and 1 senior manager from HR. Carl, notably, was not among them. But Haley recognized 2 of the others as people who had laughed at jokes made at her expense. Now they looked tense, uncertain, like passengers who had boarded the wrong flight and realized it too late. Emily didn't offer pleasantries. She didn't sit. She simply looked at them and said, "Close the door." The sound of it shutting behind them felt like a seal against the world outside. Emily stepped forward and tapped a button on the digital screen mounted to the wall. It lit up with the file Haley had shown her. The image of the doctored slide filled the room in high resolution. Haley's graduation photo, the mocking caption. No one spoke. Emily allowed the silence to stretch deliberately. Then she turned to them. This was uploaded to the internal drive used for campaign presentations. It was placed in a folder labeled Frida Laughs. It was seen by at least 12 employees and remained visible for more than 36 hours before being deleted. No report was made to HR. No action was taken. Does anyone wish to explain that? The HR manager, a tall woman named Marla with a clipped voice, shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't see this file in our compliance logs. If it was deleted..." Emily cut her off. "Don't finish that sentence. You've received 3 complaints in the last month referencing subtle harassment within the innovation team. You categorized all 3 as personality clashes and took no further action." Marla stiffened. "We weren't aware the subject was my sister." Emily's voice remained calm. "I'm aware, and it should not have mattered. Harassment is harassment. It does not require a pedigree check." The heads of marketing and innovation exchanged looks. One of them opened his mouth, hesitated, then said, "We didn't realize the extent. Haley never came to us directly." "Because she thought you'd treat her like everyone else," Emily replied, her voice soft but razor-sharp. "Which, in a way, you did. You treated her like a scapegoat, like an amusement, like someone who didn't deserve dignity. So yes, she got exactly what everyone else gets when they're not in your social circle. And that's the problem." The room was silent. Haley felt the heat of her own pulse in her neck, but she stood still. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't spectacle. It was the moment the illusion cracked, the moment the curtain lifted and left no one comfortable in its wake. Emily turned toward her tablet again. "Effective immediately, we are initiating a formal review of the innovation team's internal communications and project documentation. Any employee found to have participated in targeted misconduct will be suspended pending investigation. Our zero-tolerance policy has existed on paper long enough. Now it will exist in action." The room remained frozen. Then, slowly, Marla gave a stiff nod, her mouth pressed into a line. The others followed, some with muttered acknowledgments, others with the quiet resignation of those who had seen enough corporate storms to recognize when they had lost their footing. As they left, Emily remained still, her gaze fixed on the screen even after it powered down. Only when the door clicked shut behind them did she exhale. Once, shallow and controlled. She looked at Haley. "I should have stepped in earlier," she said. Haley shook her head. "I needed to know if I could stand on my own." "And you did." Emily finally sat, folding her hands. "But you shouldn't have had to." There was another silence between them, different from the ones before. It wasn't cold. It was a space cleared between two people who had worn armor so long they'd forgotten how to lower it. Emily broke the silence first, her voice lower now. "I was afraid if I gave you anything, support, recognition, they'd say you hadn't earned it." Haley met her gaze. "And if you didn't give me anything, I'd be invisible." They held that truth between them, its weight undeniable. Then Emily's mouth tilted into the smallest of curves. Not quite a smile, but close. "You're not invisible anymore." The days that followed moved with the momentum of consequence. HR, suddenly galvanized, began issuing formal warnings and interviewing staff. The casual sarcasm that once drifted through team meetings evaporated. Several employees were placed on administrative leave. Carl avoided eye contact with everyone. The Friday Laughs folder was wiped from the server, but its echo lingered. Conversations now occurred in quieter tones. The floor had lost its appetite for cruelty, and Haley, no longer alone, continued to show up. Earlier, sharper, stronger. She didn't throw accusations, she didn't gloat, she just worked. And now, for the first time, people watched her with something other than amusement or contempt. They watched her with awareness, with caution, and, from a few, with the tentative beginnings of respect. One afternoon, a junior analyst named Leah stopped by her desk. She didn't say much, just asked if Haley wanted to review some survey data together over lunch. It was the first genuine offer of inclusion since she'd arrived. Haley accepted with a quiet thank you. Later that evening, Emily stood in her office watching the city darken. She held a cup of tea in her hand, untouched. On her desk sat a new photo frame, not yet filled. Next to it, a folder labeled New Initiatives, Internal Culture and Ethics. She tapped her finger against the desk, then picked up her phone. "Meredith, set a meeting with the board. I want to talk about systemic reform, and bring me the project proposals from the innovation team, especially Haley's." She hung up and looked out the window again. Change, she realized, was not born in policy. It began with people deciding they were done being silent. And she was done. The wind had shifted. Not in the literal sense. Outside, the New York air remained its usual cocktail of early summer haze and sidewalk heat, but in the rhythm of the office itself. There was a different kind of silence now, a taut, anticipatory hush that hung in the air like a held breath. People walked more carefully, spoke with more restraint. Laughter still existed, but it was thinner, more cautious, as if everyone had suddenly remembered there were ears in the walls and consequences in the floors. Haley noticed it immediately. When she stepped into the office that Monday morning, her arrival no longer blended into the background. The receptionist, usually distracted by her own screen, looked up and offered a polite nod. In the elevator, a man from finance held the door open without the forced smile she had grown used to. It was subtle, but undeniable. The lines had shifted. Her presence now drew acknowledgement, even if it wasn't warm. Her desk remained the same, untouched and familiar. But her relationship to it had changed. She no longer approached it as a place to weather storms, but as a post from which to contribute. She opened her laptop and began her routine, checking updates, reviewing shared folders, confirming deliverables, but this time without the weight of invisibility pressing on her shoulders. The investigation had not only disrupted the dynamics of her floor, it had sent a ripple effect through the company's hierarchy. 3 employees had been reassigned. 1 had resigned. HR had announced a new employee review system, one that would involve peer feedback, anonymous reporting channels, and third-party audits. The culture Emily had once assumed could run itself had proven fallible, and she had decided, abruptly but with characteristic finality, that it was time to rebuild. Haley found herself in meetings more often, now not as a formality or afterthought, but because people had begun to realize she had something to offer. It wasn't a flood of sudden appreciation. Bailey Systems was not the kind of place where change came wrapped in applause, but there were glimmers. People stopped talking over her in team huddles. They began asking for her input in the drafting stages of campaigns, not just to clean up the results after the fact. Someone forwarded her a data set without her asking. Another emailed her a research article and said, "Thought you'd find this interesting." Haley took none of it for granted. She responded to every gesture with quiet professionalism, never overstepping, never retreating. Her tone was clear, her standards rising. And though some still looked at her with narrowed eyes, others had begun to see her as what she had always wanted to be, a contributor, not a charity case. It was during one of these meetings, a particularly uninspired brainstorm where the energy in the room had dipped to near silence, that Haley spoke up. The team was struggling with engagement metrics for a mid-tier client. Their usual tools had delivered diminishing returns, and no one seemed to know why. After several minutes of circular conversation, Haley calmly suggested an alternative approach, creating a machine learning-based diagnostic tool that would analyze team communication flows and flag potentially toxic trends within working groups before they could damage morale and output. At first, no one spoke. Then, one of the analysts, David, frowned and said, "Like a social listening tool, but turned inward?" "More like a behavioral pattern identifier," Haley clarified. "It wouldn't record conversations or violate privacy. It would process metadata, email volume, meeting overlaps, response delays, tone indicators in written communication, to establish benchmarks and detect abnormalities. The goal wouldn't be punishment, just awareness." The room was quiet for a moment longer, but it was a different silence this time, curious, not dismissive. "That could be interesting," someone finally said. "If it worked." Haley didn't react. She simply said, "I'd like to build a prototype on my own time." Emily heard about the proposal before the day was over. The report reached her desk through 2 separate channels, one from the head of R&D, who flagged it as potentially disruptive, and the other from Meredith, who simply added a 1-line note to the bottom of her end-of-day summary. "Haley's idea, worth watching." Emily made no move to intervene. Instead, she forwarded the summary to the CTO and requested quiet resource allocation. Not a full team, not funding, but enough server access and back-end support for a functioning prototype. Then she closed the tab and said nothing. Haley, unaware of this, stayed late every night that week. She worked through frameworks, built test scripts, mapped user flows. Leah from Analytics offered to help with correlation modeling. A junior developer volunteered code review. Piece by piece, a skeleton formed. A program with the provisional name Orbit, Organizational Reflection and Behavioral Insight Tool. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had come into the company as the object of surveillance, the subject of cruel observation. Now, she was building the very tool that would prevent others from suffering the same. By the end of the month, the prototype was live. It wasn't perfect, but it functioned. The dashboard offered team leaders a risk map, color-coded indicators based on engagement consistency, cross-department responsiveness, and micro-patterns of exclusion or overload. It didn't name names, it didn't accuse, but it made the invisible visible. The first test cases, anonymized and voluntary, returned startling insights. One team flagged for burnout had higher than average workload sharing but also abnormally low interdepartment communication, indicating a silo. Another showed subtle marginalization of a remote employee whose input lagged days behind the rest of the team, simply because no one looped her in directly. The managers who received the reports didn't deny them. They requested next steps. Emily scheduled a private demonstration. Haley presented it in the executive conference room without stumbling, without hedging. She explained the tool's logic, its limitations, and its potential. She spoke without notes. Her voice was steady, her eyes level. When she finished, the room was still. Emily leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen once against the glass table. "We'll pilot it internally," she said, "company-wide, starting next quarter." Haley nodded. She had expected more questions, more hesitation. But in that moment, she realized that Emily's silence wasn't indifference anymore. It was trust. The next weeks unfolded with measured acceleration. Haley was given a temporary team, a dedicated workspace, and access to expanded data sets. She began preparing for rollout, coordinating with department heads and systems engineers. The same people who had once overlooked her now scheduled meetings around her calendar. There were still skeptics, of course, and always would be, but the tone had changed. Even Carl, whose reassignment had landed him in a different department, passed her once in the lobby and gave a clipped nod. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't defiance either. It was acknowledgement. Haley went home each night with her shoulders straighter, her thoughts clearer. She began to sleep better. She started cooking again. She called her mother. She even caught herself laughing during lunch one day, a real laugh, full and unguarded. The woman who had stood alone by the window weeks ago, wondering whether she had a future here, now moved with purpose and certainty. Emily watched all this from a distance. She never hovered. She didn't praise. But one evening, she left a single-page memo on Haley's desk. It wasn't signed. It wasn't official. It simply read, "This is what leadership looks like." Haley read it once. Then she folded it and placed it in the back pocket of her notebook, where it stayed. The culture of Bailey Systems didn't transform overnight, but the seed had been planted. And, unlike before, it was no longer growing in silence. Summer came to the city slowly, as if testing whether the streets were ready to bloom again. The skyline shimmered in waves of heat by mid-afternoon, and the park across from Bailey Systems buzzed with tourists and office workers sharing benches beneath the narrow shadows of trees. Inside the building, the light poured through the windows in wide ribbons, illuminating the glass walls and stone floors with a quiet brilliance that made everything feel more exposed, more seen. It was a fitting reflection of the change that had taken place inside. The launch of Orbit had gone better than anyone anticipated. What had begun as a quiet prototype developed on borrowed time now powered a new standard across every department. The internal pilot had revealed patterns no manager had thought to question: unconscious exclusion, overburdened clusters of employees who never complained, isolated team members quietly fading into disconnection. Some resisted the implications. Others found relief in finally understanding why something had felt off in their units for months, even years. There were those who remained skeptical, especially in leadership, but even they could not ignore the early results: measurable reductions in burnout, fewer interpersonal conflicts, and a notable improvement in retention. Haley had become something of a symbol, though no one said it aloud. Her name was spoken now not with curiosity or derision, but with a kind of thoughtful respect, a recognition earned the hard way. She moved through the halls with ease. The wariness in her eyes had softened, replaced by focus. She was no longer waiting to be acknowledged. She had become necessary. One morning, as she arrived on the floor that had once greeted her with apathy, she was met instead with the quiet nods of teammates and even a small coffee waiting on her desk. No note, no announcement, just a simple act of consideration. She paused for a moment, her fingers curling around the warm paper cup. She smiled faintly, then sat and opened her laptop. The day passed in a calm rhythm of meetings, updates, and strategy calls. By evening, the floor had mostly emptied. She remained, as she often did, tidying loose ends, organizing notes for the next sprint cycle, and drafting improvements for the next phase of orbit. When the building grew quieter still, she stood and stretched, looking out across the city as the lights began to glitter into focus one by one. She had done what she came to do, but it didn't feel like an ending. If anything, it was a foundation. That week, Bailey Systems received official notification that Orbit had been nominated for recognition at the annual Tech Human Awards, a prestigious conference celebrating innovation in ethical workplace technology. The nomination alone placed the company among names twice its size and budgets 3 times as large. Emily read the announcement in her office without expression, then closed the email and called Meredith. "Make arrangements for the conference," she said. "I want Haley to present." The award ceremony was held in Boston 2 weeks later. The auditorium swelled with executives, engineers, journalists, and researchers from across the globe. Haley stood backstage, calm in appearance, though her hands were slick against the cue cards she hadn't used once during rehearsal. When they called her name, she stepped forward into the light without hesitation. Her speech was not polished in the way some expected. It wasn't filled with buzzwords or rhetorical devices. It was honest, stripped of pretense, delivered with the clarity of someone who had lived her subject matter. She spoke of inclusion, not as a slogan, but as a system, an architecture of small decisions made every day by people who chose to see or to ignore. She told the story not of her suffering, but of how silence enables suffering, and how awareness alone could begin to shift the balance. She talked about Orbit as a tool of reflection, not surveillance. Not punishment, but prevention. She ended with a simple truth. It's not about technology. It's about seeing people before they disappear. When she walked off stage, the applause followed her. Emily was waiting near the exit corridor, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her stance, a quiet pride maybe, that softened the edge of her usual stillness. Haley didn't wait for a comment. She didn't need one. They walked out together. Later that night, Emily invited her to dinner, not in the usual way, not as an obligation or formality. It was a quiet offering. They sat at a small restaurant tucked into a quiet corner of the back bay, far from the buzz of the conference. They ordered without fanfare, talked about the food, the city, nothing heavy, just the small comforts of two people no longer strangers to each other. At the end of the meal, Emily reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She slid it across the table. "What is it?" Haley asked. "An offer," Emily said. "Permanent position. Director of Behavioral Insight and Systems Integrity." Haley looked at her. "You're creating a department. I'm asking you to lead it." Haley didn't answer right away. She took the envelope, laid it in her lap, and let her fingers rest on it. It was what she had worked for. More than that, it was the result of something she built from the ashes of humiliation. But she wanted to be sure. "Not because of who I am to you?" she asked, not accusing, only confirming. "Because of what you did," Emily replied, her voice level, her eyes unwavering. Haley nodded once. Then yes. A few months later, back in New York, the walls of Bailey Systems bore the signs of transformation. The old rules of decorum and hierarchy still existed. Some parts of the culture changed slowly, others not at all. But the tone had shifted. New employees were introduced to Orbit as part of their onboarding. Managers were trained to interpret its results, not as mandates, but as tools to grow. Feedback loops became expected, not feared. Office gossip now skated carefully around the awareness that someone, somewhere, might ask, "Is this helping?" Haley's new office was modest but open, intentionally designed to invite collaboration. She insisted her team remain small, agile. Her desk bore a few personal items, but one thing stood out. A framed memo, unsigned, unlaminated, slightly creased at the corners. She never explained its origin. She never had to. One evening, she received a calendar invite from Emily. Informal catch-up, rooftop lounge, 6:30 p.m. She accepted without a second thought. They sat together on the upper terrace of the building, a breeze cutting through the warmth of early September. Below them, the city pulsed with life. Around them, the sky began to darken into deep purples and fading blue. "You've built something real," Emily said. "So did you," Haley replied. They sat in silence for a moment. "I used to think the only way to lead was to be untouchable," Emily said quietly. "That power came from distance. But I was wrong." "You weren't wrong," Haley said. "You were just early. There wasn't room for softness back then." Emily looked at her. "Do you think there is now?" "I think we're making it." The sun finally dipped below the skyline. Lights flickered on across the city like signals, quiet and insistent. As they stood and prepared to head back down, Emily paused. "Do you remember that photo in my apartment?" she asked. "The one with the swing?" Emily nodded. "I kept it hidden for a long time. I thought I had to forget who I was to become who I am. But I think maybe I was wrong about that, too." Haley smiled. "We don't have to choose." And they walked down together, not as the girl who once stood in her sister's shadow and the woman who cast it, but as equals, two lives that had bent toward each other again, not by accident, but by choice. In Emily's office the next morning, a new photograph stood beside the old one. It was of the two of them, captured after the conference, each with a hand on the award they had won. Behind them stood their company, not perfect, not finished, but changing, becoming. And somewhere in the silence of those high glass walls, something had shifted for good. If you found this story meaningful, consider subscribing to the channel. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, and check out the other videos for more.